The first cold rain of early autumn had soaked the old city district through to its bones. Jiang Shudong stood under an umbrella outside Sister Chen's stationery store. Her left hand wrapped in bandages, a worn black briefcase with frayed edges clutched in her right. Rainwater poured through a broken rib of the umbrella, soaking half her shoulder. The shop's rolling metal door was shut tight, a sliver of dim yellow light seeping through the crack at the bottom. She had not stood in this alley for 3 years. The old locust tree at the entrance was still there. The stone stool beneath it still there. Even the patch of peeling wall paint was exactly as she remembered. The only difference was the street lamp at the alley's mouth, new far brighter than before, its light turning the rain into silver needles driving down densely into the earth. She glanced at her watch. 8:40 p.m. Clara Benson usually closed up around this time, but typically puttered around inside for another half hour, sorting the next day's change and organizing the stationery. After 3 years with no word, she wondered if that habit had changed. Jiang Shudong stood outside the door for a while. Rainwater dripped from the hem of her coat onto the ground, pooling into a small dark stain. The dull ache radiating from her left wrist made her draw a soft, sharp breath. The bone had healed, but the tendon damage was irreversible. The doctor said she had recovered well, at least preserving sensation and basic function, though her hand would still tremble if she wrote for too long. Too long. For an ordinary person that meant 3 or 4 hours. For her it meant about 1. She reached out with her right hand and rapped on the metal door. A rustling sound came from inside, followed by Clara Benson's wary voice. "Who is it?" "We're closed. Come back tomorrow." "Aunt Clara, it's me." Silence. A full 5 seconds of silence. Then the metal door rattled upward with a crash, revealing Clara Benson's round, kind face, etched with disbelief. Clara had gained weight. 3 years ago, she had been a slightly plump, middle-aged woman. Now she was genuinely round. Her hair was permed and dyed a chestnut brown. She wore a baggy t-shirt with a Mickey Mouse print, her apron still stained with grease that hadn't been fully wiped off. She stood in the doorway, mouth agape, eyes wide, a fistful of loose change still clutched in her hand. Just as Jiang Shudong had guessed, she had been in the middle of sorting the accounts. "Good heavens! You," she started and stopped 3 times, unable to get the rest of the words out. She just stared fixedly at Jiang Shudong's face, then at the bandaged left hand, and finally at the scuffed briefcase. Her eyes immediately reddened. "What on earth happened to your hand?" Clara yanked her inside, grabbed a towel and wrapped it around her head without waiting for an answer. "Didn't you say you were doing advanced studies abroad? Why haven't you called even once in 3 years? What happened to your hand? Talk to me." The towel smelled of mothballs, clearly dug out from the depths of a cabinet. Jiang Shudong was hit by this familiar yet strange scent and felt a slight sting in her nose. She let Clara pull her to a chair behind the counter, accepted the cup of hot water handed to her, and held it with both hands, feeling the warmth spread through her palms. "Car accident," she said. Her tone was flat, as if stating a fact that had nothing to do with her. "I spent 2 years recovering. I can move it now." She flexed her left hand, demonstrating for Clara. All 5 fingers could bend, but the range of motion in her ring and pinky fingers was severely limited, freezing at a certain angle like a jammed gear. 2 surgical scars ran across the back of her hand, from the base of her thumb to the inside of her wrist, gleaming a faint pink under the light, the color of newly healed flesh. "I just can't hold a pen and write for long periods. After half an hour my hand starts to shake." Clara stared at the hand for a long time. She was no stranger to scars. Years ago, working in the textile mill, she had tended to co-workers who had lost fingers to the machinery. But this hand was different. She knew this hand too well. 3 years ago, these hands flipped through case files in mock court with the swift precision of a blade, typed up complaints on a keyboard as fast as rain. She had seen these hands grip a fountain pen to sign billion-dollar merger agreements, seen them fill out forms for impoverished elderly clients at legal aid clinics. Now those hands bore 2 new scars, the fingers skewed to one side, the joint of the ring finger slightly protruding, like a small stone embedded in the flesh. "Then why did you come back?" Clara suddenly erupted, her voice high and sharp, tears spilling from her eyes. "Those people are still looking for you. Your father, that heartless Benjamin Harper, Just last month told a financial magazine that he had severed all ties with you. He told reporters right to their faces that you brought it on yourself, that you were no daughter of his. Do you know that magazine was on the rack at the newsstand right at the alley entrance? I had to walk past it every single day. I know. And you still came back. Clara slapped the table in fury, scattering loose change clattering across the floor. Why did you come back? So they can destroy you all over again? How many lives do you think you have left for them to ruin? Evelyn Harper, if your mother were still here. She choked off, as if the words had been physically snatched from her throat. The air in the shop suddenly went still. The old wall clock ticked on. The sound of the rain filtered through the metal door, muffled, like someone burying their sobs in a quilt. Evelyn said nothing. She pulled a magazine from her briefcase. The cover of Commercial Law Weekly screamed in bold, black type, searing to the eyes. Former legal star Evelyn Harper disbarred for trade secret leak. Core business of her mother's firm now fully taken over by younger daughter Vivian Harper. The accompanying photo showed Vivian Harper standing before the firm's new sign, dressed in a white tailored suit, the gold medal originally engraved with Evelyn's name pinned to her left lapel, smiling as radiantly as peach blossoms in March. That face shared a few similarities with her own. Both were daughters of Benjamin Harper. Both inherited the refined features of their mothers. But Vivian's jaw was sharper, her lips thinner, and when she smiled, the corners of her mouth lifted to a carefully calibrated angle, a smile she had practiced in front of a mirror countless times, each public appearance timed to absolute perfection. Evelyn folded the magazine neatly and put it back in her bag, her movements light, as if putting away an object not worth a second glance. I've seen it, she said. Aunt Clara, is that shop at the entrance of the alley still empty? It's empty, sure, but, Clara answered instinctively, then jolted back to her senses. Why are you asking about that? I've rented it. I'm hanging the sign tomorrow. A copy shop. The air fell silent again for a few seconds. The expression on Clara's face shifted from confusion to shock, from shock to disbelief, and finally settled on a complex, almost pained look of tenderness. She slowly crouched down and began picking up the scattered change, one bill and coin at a time, straightening them and placing them in the drawer. Her movements were very slow, as if she needed these repetitive motions to digest information she could not accept. Are you insane? She finally spoke, her voice drained of its earlier fury, leaving only exhaustion and heartache. You're a top-tier lawyer who handled cross-border M&A deals. You're coming back to open a copy shop? To print people's ID cards? Do you know the last tenant of that shop sold roasted sweet potatoes? Is your brain damaged too? Evelyn didn't argue. She sat in the chair, finished the hot water in her cup, then stood and walked to the counter. On Clara's counter sat an old radio and beside it, a photo frame holding a yellowed picture. Taken 10 years ago, on the day Evelyn received her law license, Clara had snapped the photo right outside the shop. The girl in the picture wore a brand new attorney's robe, smiling without reservation at the camera, her eyes bright as stars freshly plucked from the water. Back then she believed the law was the sword of justice. Back then she trusted that every case led to the truth, every judge upheld their conscience. Back then she didn't yet know that in some people's world, there was no truth, only leverage. My mother's firm now has Vivian Harper's name on the door, Evelyn said. Her voice was very soft, but every word was etched with ice. The office she left behind now has Charles Grant's people sitting in it. Her partnership certificate was framed by Vivian and hung on the wall of the conference room, with a sticky note pasted on it that says, "In memory of our former partner." In memory, like commemorating someone who's dead. Aunt Clara, I didn't come back to surrender. But before I win, I need every single one of them to believe I'm already broken. Clara stared at her dumbfounded. This girl she had watched grow up, 3 years ago, she was still a sharp, passionate young woman who could argue circles around anyone in a mock court, who would run to her shop after winning a case to celebrate with a bowl of sweet red bean soup, who would cry her eyes out when a poor elderly man's demolition case was dismissed. Back then, Evelyn Harper was razor-sharp, blazing like a newly forged sword, believing that if it was bright enough, it could slice through any darkness. Now, the woman standing before her had a stillness in her eyes like a deep frozen pool. The edge was still there, but it was no longer worn on the outside. It was sheathed in her very bones, hidden beneath those 2 scars, carried in each measured steady breath. Clara suddenly felt a sharp pang in her chest. "What are you planning to do?" she asked. Evelyn pulled a laptop from her briefcase and opened it. The desktop background was an image, black background with a line of white text. "The law must never yield to injustice." It was the phrase her mother had loved to say most in her life, the last word she had left for Evelyn. The desktop was crammed with densely packed files, cross-border capital flow records, equity structure charts penetrating layers of shell companies, archived email correspondences, transcribed audio recordings, and dozens of witness interview memos marked with dates and names. Every file was named with rigorous standardization, arranged by date and evidence category, neatly covering the entire screen. Clara couldn't understand those files, but she recognized the naming convention. It was the standard format for law firm archive management, the very method Evelyn's mother had taught her, step by step, years ago. Behind every number was a link in the chain. Linked together, they formed a complete picture. "Is all this enough?" Clara swallowed. "Not enough." Evelyn closed the laptop and looked up at her. "I still need the complete surveillance footage from the parking garage that day, the full set of working papers from Grant Group's cross-border listing project, and the complete official case file from the Bar Association's disciplinary hearing. All those things are in one person's hands." "Who?" "Franklin Shaw." Clara sucked in a breath of cold air. She braced herself against the counter and slowly sat down on a chair, her face changing. "Judge Shaw? Wasn't he forced into early retirement? I heard he sold his house and now lives out in the suburbs in an abandoned courthouse turned into a storage warehouse. His wife passed away the year before last. His son is overseas and never comes back. He's all alone. You're going to him, those people are all watching him. If you go looking for him, won't he? He has the evidence from 3 years ago." Evelyn cut her off. "He was the only one who cast a dissenting vote at the hearing. For that one dissenting vote, he lost a career he spent 30 years building. Aunt Clara, I'm not just going to find him. I'm going to give him back what he's owed." Clara opened her mouth, but in the end she just sighed. "Be careful," she said, her voice dropping low. "Those people, if they could do such a vicious thing to you 3 years ago, they won't have grown soft in 3 years. That sister of yours." "She's not my sister." Evelyn's tone was completely flat, as if she were stating a legal fact. "She's the daughter my father had with another woman. While my mother was still alive, Benjamin Harper had already set up her and her mother in a villa on the west side of town, siphoning support payments from the firm's accounts every month. Less than 3 months after my mother died, he moved that woman and her daughter into our house. So Vivian Harper is not my sister. She's living proof of my father's infidelity during his marriage." She delivered these words with such utter calm that Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She knew Evelyn was not a cold person. 3 years ago, this same girl would crouch in the rain and cry over an injured stray cat on the street. But right now, speaking of her father's betrayal, her half-sister, her mother's death, her tone was like she was reading a dull case file. This calm was not coldness. It was the near-brutal clarity of a person who had fully digested all her pain, until nothing was left but lucidity. Clara didn't say another word. She turned and went into the back room, returning a long moment later with 2 bowls of sweet red bean soup. Still the same old recipe. The beans cooked until they melted, with tangerine peel and rock sugar, a thin layer of osmanthus flowers floating on top. Evelyn took the bowl, lowered her head to breathe in the scent, and something deep in her eyes flickered. "It's been 3 years since I've tasted this," she said. "You deserve it," Clara said without malice. "Whose fault is it you didn't call for 3 years?" Evelyn smiled. It was her first genuine smile of the night, very faint, like a small ripple blown across the surface of water, gone in an instant. She lowered her head and drank the soup, spoonful by spoonful, very slowly, as if trying to memorize every familiar note of sweetness on her tongue. Outside, the rain kept falling. The radio played an old song, the signal weak, the sound breaking and returning in snatches, as if singing through a layer of water. Chapter 2. Eve's Copy and Document Services. 3 days later, A sign reading Eve's Copy and Document Services was hung above the door of the first shop at the mouth of the old alley. The day she hung the sign was a clear day, a rare fine day in early autumn. Pale sunlight lay thinly on the cobblestone path, steaming a faint mist from the alley that had been soaked by days of rain. The leaves of the old locust tree at the entrance were starting to yellow, occasionally releasing one or two to spiral down and land beneath the new sign. Evelyn had written the sign herself. White letters on a black background, on a wooden board she'd scavenged from a second-hand market. She deliberately switched the brush to her left hand when writing. What her right hand could have rendered in a single beautiful stroke of semi-cursive calligraphy came out crooked and clumsy from her left, horizontal lines not level, verticals not straight. The strokes were uneven, the characters crude and tottering, like a child's first attempt at calligraphy. Evelyn stepped back to take a look and nodded with satisfaction. This sign was exactly what she wanted. Shabby, clumsy, utterly unremarkable, exuding from every angle the impoverished air of someone just scraping by. The shop was tiny, barely 200 square feet. To the left as you entered was a second-hand printer, salvaged from a flea market, a model so old the manufacturer had stopped making it. It hummed and wheezed like an asthmatic cat. To the right was an old desk, half its paint worn off to reveal the dark wood beneath. In the corner were stacked a few boxes of cut-rate copy paper, the brand name on the packaging something she'd never even heard of. The most valuable item was an old desktop computer that took a full minute and a half to boot up, its monitor the chunky, old-fashioned LCD kind with a yellowed stain bleeding across one edge of the screen. At the back of the shop, a tiny space of 3 or 4 square meters was partitioned off, furnished with a fold-up cot and a plastic wardrobe, her living quarters. No kitchen, no shower. The bathroom was the public restroom at the alley entrance. Clara came to look and her eyes went red. "What is this? You can't stay here. Stay at my place." Evelyn said it wasn't necessary. Living here was more convenient. Clara took another look at the cot, so narrow it would be hard to even turn over, and said nothing more. She turned and left. The next morning, she showed up with an old microwave and a thermos, and without a word, stacked them in a corner of the shop. On the first day of business, things were as slow as cold, leftover porridge. Occasionally someone poked their head in, saw the bandage on her hand and the shabby equipment, and retreated. Old Mr. Liu, who ran the hardware store next door, came by to look around, clicked his tongue, and said the shop was too shabby and asked if the printer even worked. Evelyn said it worked, it was just slow. Half doubting, old Mr. Liu handed her his ID card for a test copy. The machine hummed and groaned for a long time before spitting out 2 crooked copies, a black line running along the edges. Old Mr. Liu sighed, said he'd feel bad not paying, and stubbornly shoved $2 at her before leaving. Evelyn put the $2 in the drawer and kept waiting. The second day was slightly better than the first. The owner of the newsstand at the alley entrance brought a rental contract for her to print, saying the tenant had lost theirs and needed a replacement. Evelyn spent half an hour typing it up on the computer, perfectly formatted, and charged $15. The newsstand owner looked at the contract this way and that, said her formatting was even better than the print shops outside, but that she was too slow. She said her hand was injured, she couldn't go faster. The owner nodded sympathetically, then asked if she could also write things like legal complaints. She said no, she only did printing and copying. The owner left, a little disappointed. She was lying. Of course she could write complaints. 3 years ago, her drafted complaints were studied as templates by other lawyers. Even Charles Grant had half-jokingly praised her document skills. But now was not the time to reveal her abilities. Right now, she was a washed-up lawyer with a revoked license, a broken left hand, a dead-end life, a pathetic woman reduced to printing copies in a back alley for anyone with a few dollars. She had to play this part perfectly, because only when those people believed she was utterly destroyed could she quietly, in the shadows, accomplish what she needed to do. It wasn't until the afternoon of the third day that the first genuine customer pushed open the door. It was Auntie Sullivan from the residential complex across the street, mid-50s, plump, clutching a USB flash drive, her face creased with an anxious smile. She brought in a gust of wind as she entered, blowing several blank sheets of paper off the counter. Muttering apologies, she crouched down to help pick them up. "You're Eve, right? Clara sent me." Auntie Sullivan placed the USB drive on the counter, and clasped her hands together in a pleading gesture. My husband needs to sue a real estate developer. They say we need to write something called a complaint. I asked at a law firm and they wanted $3,000, way too expensive. Can you write one here? Evelyn took the USB, plugged it into the computer, and scanned the materials inside. A textbook dispute over a home purchase agreement. The developer had promised delivery by the end of last year, and now it was 9 months late, with not a penny of penalties paid. 2 standard form clauses in the contract were clear violations of the implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing, limiting the developer's liability in extremely harsh terms. The monetary stakes weren't huge, $30,000 to $40,000 in penalties and damages, but the legal relationships were clean and the evidence chain was complete. The purchase agreement, payment receipts, the developer's delay notice, WeChat logs of several rounds of negotiation. Auntie Sullivan's husband had kept everything meticulously. I can write it. Evelyn scrolled through the materials, a full litigation strategy already forming in her mind. Rush delivery. Finished by noon tomorrow. Standard 3 days. The price difference is double. Rush. The faster the better. Auntie Sullivan said hurriedly, then carefully added, how much for the rush job? $600. $600. Auntie Sullivan's eyes went wide, repeating the number in disbelief. The law firm wanted $3,000. Volume makes up for it. Evelyn accepted the USB, her right hand typing a few lines on the keyboard. Her right hand was still steady, typing fast and accurate, no different from any ordinary lawyer's. But she deliberately slowed her pace to avoid looking too proficient. Articles 8 and 15 of your husband's contract have issues. Article 8 broadens the force majeure scope far too much, even including government approval delays. That's unreasonable. Article 15 rigs the penalty calculation. The rate is the standard $10,000 per day, but they secretly moved the calculation start date to 30 business days after delivery, effectively dragging it out another month. When you file, you can attach a claim for punitive damages. I'll include it in the complaint for you. Auntie Sullivan's mouth opened, and her eyes suddenly reddened. Eve, you're so honest. Those lawyers just quoted me a price right away. They didn't tell me any of this. None of them mentioned these problems in the clauses. Not every lawyer is like that, Evelyn said. You ran into the wrong ones. Were you a lawyer before? Auntie Sullivan studied her, her gaze pausing on the bandaged left hand, then settling on her face. The way you talk, it doesn't sound like someone who runs a copy shop. Evelyn's fingers paused on the keyboard for a fraction of a second. I studied law for a few years. My hand was injured. I can't appear in court, so I just do document work. She smoothly deflected and began printing the list of materials needed for the retainer. Leave your number. I'll call you when it's ready tomorrow morning. The next morning at 11, when Auntie Sullivan came to pick up the documents, Evelyn handed her the printed complaint and evidence index. The complaint was 6 pages, structurally complete and logically rigorous, from the prayer for relief to the statement of facts to the legal grounds. The evidence index was divided into 5 groups: proof of standing, proof of contract, proof of breach, proof of damages, and legal authorities. Each piece of evidence followed by its purpose. She had even prepared the party information sheet required for filing with the court. Auntie Sullivan put on her reading glasses, read 2 pages, and her hands began to tremble. This is written so well. Every claim has a legal basis, and you've marked every loophole in the contract. Eve, what kind of education do you have? How did you end up in a place like this? I studied law for a few years. My hand was injured, can't appear in court, so I just do document work. Evelyn repeated the line in the same even tone, taking the $600 and placing it in the drawer. Within half a day, Auntie Sullivan returned with 5 of her neighbors. The legal troubles these 5 neighbors brought were all over the map. One's son had been injured on a construction site and the contractor wouldn't pay. One had loaned money to a relative who was now stiffing them. One had been fired without cause and wasn't even given severance. One's ex-husband wasn't paying child support after the divorce. And the most complex, a property agreement for an international marriage, the husband being French, married in the U.S., but the assets involved. Properties in both the U.S. and France, plus equity in a Cayman Islands company. They crowded the tiny shop, chattering away. 6 people in a space of 200 square feet, barely room to turn around. The women pressed around the counter, all talking over each other about their situations, each more urgent than the last. Auntie Sullivan stood at the front, waving her arms like the leader of a flock of sparrows, trying to keep order. One at a time, one at a time. Eve's hand is hurt, don't all crowd her at once. Evelyn took the materials one by one, quickly scanning each set. For several simple labor disputes and private loan cases, she gave legal opinions on the spot, quoting fees between $500 and $1,000. The international marriage case she studied for several more minutes, pulling a copy of the state family code and its interpretive case law from a drawer, finding the relevant provisions before quoting a price. This involves the characterization of foreign assets and the division of shares in a Cayman company. It's a complex case. The review needs to be thorough. The fee is higher, $5,000. Only $5,000? The woman's eyes went wide. I went to a law firm before, and they said international divorce cases start at $20,000. Volume makes up for it, Evelyn said again, the same 4 words. The women were overjoyed, almost ready to bring every lawsuit in the entire complex to her doorstep. Auntie Sullivan stood to the side doing the math for her, muttering, Old Zhang's demolition case, Mrs. Lee's medical malpractice, Old Wang's case about his no-good son stealing the house. Eve, there's at least 17 or 18 lawsuits in our complex alone. They'll all come to you from now on. Evelyn lowered her head and straightened a stack of copy paper, her tone flat. My license was revoked. I can't take cases. I can only help you draft documents. I can't represent you in court. You take the materials I write to the courthouse to file, but when it comes time for the hearing, you'll still need to hire an attorney or appear on your own behalf. The women exchanged a look full of sympathy. Auntie Sullivan couldn't help asking, Eve, why was your license revoked? Your work is so good. You don't seem like the type who would mess up. 3 years ago I was framed in a case, she said lightly, as if talking about a squabble between 2 vegetable vendors at the alley entrance. I'm appealing it now. Waiting for the result. She didn't elaborate and the women didn't press. The people of this old neighborhood had a simple, tacit understanding. Don't ask about things that aren't your business, but always help when help is needed. Auntie Sullivan was the first to thump her chest and declare, Eve, you're a good person. Good people don't carry false blame forever. You'll turn that case around for sure. The other women chimed in, their voices so loud the hardware store owner next door poked his head out to look. Evelyn smiled, placed their case materials into the drawer one by one, said, I'll start drafting tomorrow and deliver them in order. Don't worry, just be patient. And then saw them all out the door. By evening, she closed up the shop and sat at the counter, tallying the day's accounts. 5th day of business, total revenue, $3,700. Enough to cover 2 months' rent. To her of 3 years ago, this sum wouldn't have even been a meal. Back then, a legal opinion from her on a cross-border M&A deal would have been billed at 7 figures. But now this $3,700 lay in the drawer with a solid, heavy weight, each bill carrying the most genuine trust of ordinary people. She was just about to lock the money away when the light in the doorway dimmed. A man stood at the entrance. Against the backlight of the setting sun, she couldn't make out his face, only the outline of an impeccably tailored dark gray suit, the line of his shoulders drawn sharp by the fading daylight. He was tall, at least 6'2", standing under the low doorframe of the shop almost touching the top. The watch on his wrist flashed in the light and shadow, not a showy flash, but a deep blue gleam refracted from a very specific angle. Evelyn recognized that gleam. It was the distinctive cold blue dial reflection of a Patek Philippe Calatrava, worth roughly 100 years of rent on this shop. Excuse me, do you print documents? The voice was low and even, carrying the unhurried confidence of someone accustomed to making large decisions. The man stepped into the shop. As the light shifted from behind him to in front, it revealed an exceptionally striking face. His brow was high, the line from brow to nose bridge as precise as if measured with a ruler, the angle of his jaw sharp and clean, like stone shaped by a flowing current. His eyes were especially arresting, deep and penetrating in the dim shop light, the irises so dark they almost merged with the pupils, like 2 ancient wells with no visible bottom. In his hand was a thick bound stack of printed contract pages, the cover in English. On the white cardstock cover, A line of capitalized, bold, centered letters. Cross-border M&A share purchase agreement. Evelyn's gaze paused on those words for just a split second. Too fast. Her reaction was too fast. In the 0-point-something seconds it took to recognize the nature of this document, her pupils contracted an almost imperceptible fraction. She quickly suppressed the reaction, but that momentary pause still landed in the man's perception. This man was too skilled at reading people. His ability to capture detail was as famous as his trial style, sharp, no blind spots. "Printing or review?" she asked, her tone returning to its unruffled flatness. "Printing is 5 cents a page. Review is priced by page count." "Review." The man placed the contract on the counter and flipped to a page somewhere in the middle. His fingers were long, knuckles well defined, the motion of flipping the page crisp and clean, like turning the page of a judgment. He pointed to a clause circled in red ink. Section 14.3. The standard for defining a material adverse change. "What's your take on it?" Evelyn looked down. The contract used a UK-style template. Section 14.3 was the core definitional paragraph of the MAC clause. On a surface read, there didn't seem to be any major problems. The wording was standard, the structure complete, little different from any standard Anglo-American M&A contract. But if you really scrutinized the precise wording, the way someone who had actually done cross-border M&A deals would scrutinize it, you would find that a critical exception was missing from the exclusion list. Regulatory approval delay. What did that mean? It meant that if the transaction triggered an antitrust review that ran over schedule, causing the target company's financial performance to decline, the buyer would be unable to invoke the MAC clause to exit the deal. If the target company posted losses during the transitional period due to shifting market conditions, as long as the seller could demonstrate that those losses were an industry-wide phenomenon and not a specific material adverse event, the buyer would be forced to grit their teeth and close the deal, with no legal exit route. This loophole was fatal in cross-border M&A, especially in deals involving CFI-US or other national security reviews, where the unpredictability of the review timeline was the single greatest risk factor. Hands down. Section 14.3's exclusion list has an omission, Evelyn said. She picked up a pen with her right hand and wrote a line of notes in the margin. Her right hand was still steady, the handwriting neat and strong, carrying the standard legal document script drilled into every law student. Regulatory approval delay is not carved out from the definition of MAC. Once an antitrust review timeout is triggered, the buyer will bear the full transitional period risk. She didn't stop writing after that sentence. She flipped back a page and pointed to another clause. Section 9.2 has a problem too. The closing conditions only specify domestic antitrust clearance, but don't cover U or U.S. foreign investment review. The seller is a multinational group with subsidiaries in Europe. If the deal triggers the EU foreign investment screening mechanism, the review period could stretch over 12 months. This omission is a landmine buried right in the buyer's path. The man wasn't looking at the notes. He was looking at her. Specifically, he was looking at her right hand, the hand holding the pen. The way she gripped the pen was steady. Every character she wrote carried a certain long-disciplined precision. It was the kind of writing where every stroke conformed to the standard format for judicial documents. Horizontal lines level, vertical lines straight, every sweep and dot precisely placed. But what really caught his attention wasn't the handwriting itself. It was the instinctive flow she displayed while writing it. Flip to the previous page, locate the clause number, put pen to paper. The entire sequence was fluid without a single pause or hesitation. This reflex wasn't something you learned. It was muscle memory forged from years and years of handling cross-border M&A contracts. A copy shop owner could not possibly have this kind of muscle memory. For someone who runs a copy shop, you seem to know quite a lot, he said. In this line of work, you end up seeing a few contracts. Evelyn pushed the contract back toward him. Review or not? If I review it, it's by the page. Total fee, $50,000. $50,000? The man let out a short laugh that didn't reach his eyes. A top-tier law firm in the industry charges about that much to review a cross-border M&A contract. Then go to them. Evelyn settled back behind the counter, pulling out the day's change from the drawer, and continuing to count it without looking up. But I'll warn you. The problem with this contract isn't something you can fix by reviewing a few clauses. Its entire structure uses a UK-style template, but the transaction target is a subsidiary subject to CFI-US regulated National Security Review. UK-style templates are poorly adapted for CFI-US provisions. National Security Review isn't just one clause. It's an entire process. Filing, review, investigation, presidential determination. Each stage has a statutory timeline and preconditions. The UK template compresses all of this into a vague government approval. If you push this deal forward under this structure, there are at least 3 structural breach points. Fixing clauses without changing the structure is like patching the paint on a sinking ship. The shop fell quiet for a few seconds. The man's expression finally showed a trace of change. Not surprise. A man of his caliber wouldn't be easily surprised, but rather a validated suspicion that had just been confirmed. The contract was indeed for a target subject to CFI-US review, a fact not stated anywhere on the cover. She could only have inferred it from the clues buried in the clauses. How do you know the target is subject to CFI-US? He asked. Because Section 14.3, which you just flipped to show me, contains a reference to a national security clearance procedure. But the entire contract doesn't set a corresponding closing condition precedent. A purely private M&A deal would never mention this phrase. Mentioning it without setting a condition means the drafter doesn't understand CFI-US. Either the initial draft was written by a foreign law firm, or there was no U.S. lawyer on the buyer's team. Evelyn didn't lift her head, still counting money. Ones, fives, tens, straightening them one by one with the same careful attention she'd give to organizing case files. The man was silent for a few moments and then he slowly spoke. My name is Liam Ashford. The way he said those 3 words carried an unvarnished, absolute certainty. Not a boast, not an emphasis, just a statement, as if the name itself was sufficient explanation. He added nothing further, just stood there quietly, waiting for a reaction from the other side. Evelyn's hand, busy counting money, paused. Liam Ashford. Of course she knew that name. In the commercial law circles of this country, that name was synonymous with the word legend. Founder and global managing partner of Ashford Law. Vice chairman of the ICC International Court of Arbitration. Listed in the Chamber's Global Hall of Fame for arbitration for 7 consecutive years. Named by Legal 500 as the most influential arbitration lawyer in the Asia-Pacific region. The total value of cross-border arbitrations he had handled exceeded $300 billion. A single legal opinion from him could directly sway the direction of a $10 billion cross-border deal. A European multinational had once included a specific paragraph in its semi-annual financial report warning investors that Mr. Liam Ashford's involvement in arbitration proceedings could materially affect the transaction outcome. A lawyer, written into a public company's risk disclosures. But more than that, he was the sole heir to the vast Ashford business empire. That meant he possessed not just the top-tier prestige of the legal world, but also the backing of a $100 billion commercial empire spanning finance, real estate, and energy. A cross-border M&A contract from a man like this should never, ever have found its way into a copy shop in a back alley. Unless he had fully intended to come here from the very beginning. Mr. Ashford. Evelyn lifted her head, her face expressionless. Review or not? Liam Ashford looked at her, and the corner of his mouth curved slightly. The arc was faint, but completely different from the polite, generic smile he had worn before. If that earlier smile was the standard expression he presented to the outside world, appropriate, distant, watertight, then this arc carried something else. Like flipping through a rigorously bound case file and stumbling upon a page with an unnumbered annotation. Review. He left the contract on the counter. I'll come back to pick it up in 3 days. He pulled a business card from the inside pocket of his suit jacket and placed it on the counter. A dark gray card with silver-stamped lettering, so minimal it was almost severe. Just one line: Ashford Law. Liam Ashford. Below that, a phone number. No superfluous decoration, no title, no email, no address. Just a name and a number. But it was precisely this extreme simplicity that carried more weight than any pile of credentials. If you ever decide you want to take on cases again, call this number. He turned and walked out the door. His tall, dark gray silhouette was quickly swallowed by the twilight settling over the alley, disappearing into the shadow of the old locust tree and the deepening night. Evelyn picked up the business card, glanced at it and casually tossed it into a drawer. Inside that drawer were already several other business cards. A managing partner from a major law firm, who had somehow heard about her and made a special trip to catch up, saying he could offer her a consultant role, no court appearances required, just signing a few documents. The heads of 2 legal consulting companies, who had heard she was back in the country and wanted to hire her as a cross-border business advisor. And a young man who claimed to be a headhunter, his flashy business card proclaiming the nation's top legal talent search firm, wanting to poach her for a general counsel position at a major internet company. She kept all these cards in the drawer, not throwing away a single one, but also not calling a single number. She closed the drawer and let her gaze fall on the contract. 180 pages. All in English, printed on cardstock bound into a booklet, the cover marked with the name of the drafting law firm. A top-tier firm in London's financial district, its hourly billing rate even higher than the top domestic partners. But this contract, in her eyes, was riddled with holes, like someone wearing a bespoke suit but forgetting to put on pants. She picked up a red pen, flipped to the first page and began to review. Starting from the very first definition clause, she went word by word. Imprecisely defined terms were circled, with precise alternative language noted. Phrasing susceptible to ambiguity was flagged, with 3 possible interpretative paths, and their respective legal consequences listed. Logical leaps in the structure were marked with arrows, the missing links deduced. Occasionally, she switched the pen to her left hand and wrote a few notes. The strokes were slightly clumsier than her right, but every comment cut straight to the heart of the matter. The words written by her left hand, though not as neat, possessed a sharpness her right hand lacked, like the tip of a knife scoring across ice, leaving marks that were deeper, colder. Her left hand had never ever truly been destroyed. After the accident, she had spent nearly 2 years in Switzerland doing rehabilitation. From the beginning, when she couldn't move a single finger, to slowly regaining sensation, to being able to grip a pen, to writing a complete line of text. How many late nights she endured biting down on a towel until the pain passed, she had never told anyone. The doctors said her recovery was good, but only enough to reach a level of daily use. Prolonged fine motor operation was impossible. But what she needed wasn't daily use. What she needed was a hand that could perform on the arbitration podium. So she set a training regimen for herself. 3 hours of left-hand writing every day. Starting from the simplest horizontal and vertical strokes, relearning to write character by character. Her right hand was already a top-tier legal drafting instrument. Her left hand had to start from tracing books. That chasm was harder to endure than the physical pain. But she endured it, because she knew what she had to face ahead was even harder than this. 3 years later, her left hand's stable writing time had extended from 1 hour to 3. Beyond 3 hours it would still tremble, but in the crucial moments it was enough. 180 pages of contract. She reviewed it for 2 whole sleepless nights. In the early hours of the 3rd day, on the blank space of the last page, she wrote her final note with her left hand. Recommend redrafting entirely or walking away from the deal. Proceeding under current terms would leave the buyer's risk exposure uninsurable. Then she closed the contract, rubbed her aching wrist, and lay down on the fold-up cot for 3 hours. Dawn broke. Chapter 3 Echoes in the Old Alley. The copy shop slowly built a reputation throughout the old city district. The ones who came most were still the local residents. Some needed documents drafted for lawsuits. Some were small business owners who needed contracts reviewed. Some were landlords and tenants embroiled in disputes, needing mediation. Some even made a special trip from the next district over, saying a relative had told them about that Eve in the alley who's got a bad hand but really knows the law. Evelyn took all comers. Her fees were absurdly low, her turnaround shockingly fast. A complaint for $500 to $800, a contract review for $300 to $1,000, complex cases priced separately, the most expensive still never exceeding $10,000. The same work at a proper law firm would have cost at least 3 to 5 times more. What delighted the neighbors even more was that the legal documents she wrote were damned effective. Old Mr. Sullivan's housing dispute. Armed with the complaint Evelyn wrote, He went to the courthouse to file. The clerk at the filing window studied it for a long time and asked, "Which attorney wrote this complaint?" Old Mr. Sullivan said it was Eve from the copy shop at the alley entrance. The clerk just stared, speechless for a moment. When the case went to hearing, the developer's lawyer proposed a settlement on the spot and ended up paying the full penalty plus half the punitive damages. Old Mr. Sullivan was grinning from ear to ear. The workplace injury case. The arbitration application she wrote for the injured worker prompted the arbitrator at the Labor Commission to ask, "Did a professional lawyer draft these materials for you?" When the worker said Eve from the copy shop helped, the arbitrator was silent for a few seconds, then said, "Well written. She only ever used her right hand for the work. Scanning, printing, binding, making change, signing receipts. Everything done with her right hand. Her left hand was perpetually in a brace, sometimes with a silk scarf draped over it to hide the scars, hanging mostly motionless at her side. When anyone asked about her left hand, she would say lightly, 'It was injured. I don't have strength in it.' Seeing she didn't want to talk about it, people stopped asking. The people of the old town had a sense of boundaries. If you didn't want to talk about something, they wouldn't pry. But they would show their care in other ways. Auntie Sullivan would bring over a plate of dumplings every few days, claiming she'd made too many and couldn't finish them. Old Mr. Lou from the hardware store always remembered to pick up a cheap box of copy paper for her when he went to restock. Old Joe at the alley newsstand swept the front of her shop every morning, brushing it off as just something he did while sweeping his own patch. Evelyn took all of this to heart. She wasn't someone who was good at expressing emotion, especially not after these past 3 years. But she knew she owed this alley, and its people, far more than she had ever imagined. Only Clara knew the truth. One evening after the stationery shop was closed, Clara came over carrying a bowl of sweet red bean soup. She found Evelyn behind the counter practicing. The 5 fingers of her left hand were clamped around a black rubber grip strengthener, squeezing over and over, sweat beading densely on her forehead. The ring and pinky fingers moved with noticeably more stiffness than the other 3, each squeeze dragging a tiny fractional pause, as if fighting some invisible resistance. Clara stood in the doorway watching for a while, saying nothing. She noticed that Evelyn's face showed no expression during the practice. Not the kind of expression of someone forcefully suppressing pain. Clara had seen that before years ago in the textile mill, when a co-worker had their finger crushed by a machine. That was the look. Gritted teeth, furrowed brow, forcing themselves not to make a sound. But Evelyn wasn't like that. Her face was calm, one might even say relaxed. Only the sweat continuously seeping from her forehead betrayed the load her body was bearing. This calm was more heartbreaking than any contortion of pain, because it meant she had gotten used to it. "How far has your hand actually recovered?" Clara finally spoke. Evelyn removed the grip strengthener and flexed her wrist. Then she pulled a fountain pen from the pen holder, switched it to her left hand, and wrote a line of text on a sticky note. The pen flowed smoothly, the handwriting neat and sharp, from the first character to the last, with no visible tremor or pause between strokes. It was completely different from the crooked, crude characters she had painted on the shop sign. "I can write, but it's still not stable enough. I can manage a maximum of 3 hours of document drafting in a day. Any more, and it'll start to shake. What can you get done in 3 hours?" Clara set the red bean soup on the counter. "Enough to review a cross-border M&A contract." Evelyn put away the fountain pen and flexed her left fingers. The fingers, just finished with the grip training, were still a little stiff. She stretched them out one by one, bent them, stretched again, the movement slow and focused like a pianist warming up before playing. "Aunt Clara, I need to find someone. Franklin Shaw, the judge who served on the Bar Association's disciplinary committee 3 years ago. Do you know his exact address now?" Clara's face changed. She pushed the bowl of soup a little closer to Evelyn, pulled over a chair for herself and sat down. She was silent for a long moment before speaking. "Judge Shaw? What do you need him for?" "The poor man's life is miserable now. He offended the Grant family by speaking up for you back then and was forced into early retirement. He didn't even get his full pension. I heard he sold his house and now lives out in the suburbs in an abandoned old courthouse that's been turned into a storage warehouse. His wife passed away the year before last. His son is overseas and never comes back. He's all alone." "I know." Evelyn picked up the soup and took a sip. Scalding sweet, still the old familiar taste. He's holding the evidence from 3 years ago. How do you know? Because he was the only one who cast a dissenting vote at the hearing that year. Evelyn set the bowl down, her voice dropping low. Aunt Clara, that hearing had 7 committee members in total. 6 voted to revoke my license. Only Franklin Shaw voted against it and submitted a written dissent. In that dissent, he listed in detail the contradictions and flaws in the original evidence chain. He said the timeline for the trade secret leak charge didn't hold up, that the IP address on the so-called leaked email didn't match my travel itinerary records from that time, that there were inconsistencies in the witness testimony. He wrote all of this into his written dissent, attaching his own legal analysis. Everything he wrote was voted down unanimously by the other 6 at the hearing. Less than a month after the hearing, he was pushed out by the Bar Association on some pretext and forced into early retirement. The retirement paperwork was processed remarkably quickly, as if someone had already prepared the documents and was just waiting for a signature. Half his pension was withheld, the stated reason being procedural violations during his tenure. But everyone knew it was punishment for that dissenting vote. Clara's palms went cold listening to this. She knew the world was full of injustice, but to hear with her own ears how a judge had ended up in such a state for holding fast to his conscience, it still made her chest feel tight, suffocated. So his written dissent is the evidence? More than that. After the hearing, he made a backup copy of the entire case file, the original evidence, the cross-examination records, the full written transcript of the hearing audio, and his own legal analysis opinion. Aunt Clara, those documents are the complete blueprint for overturning the case. With them, I don't need to gather new evidence from scratch. I just need to take the originals Franklin Shaw preserved and file for procedural review. Clara was silent for a long while. She picked up her bowl, took a sip of soup and put it down. I know that old courthouse out in the suburbs. I used to deliver case files to the judges there back in the day. That whole area is mostly demolished now, fenced off with construction hoardings, half-collapsed buildings everywhere. No streetlights after dark. Be careful when you go looking for him. If those people find out you're looking for him, I won't let them find out. Evelyn stood up and carried her empty bowl to the sink, rinsing it clean. I'll be careful. Early the next morning, Evelyn hung a closed for the day sign on her shop door. She changed into the most inconspicuous outfit she could find. A dark gray hoodie, black pants, old sneakers, her hair tucked completely under a cap, a canvas tote bag slung over her shoulder. She didn't look like a lawyer. She looked like a small-time vendor heading to a wholesale market. She took a 2-hour bus ride to the city's edge. Heading west from the city center, the scenery outside the window grew more and more desolate. Skyscrapers gave way to low-rise factories. The factories gave way to fenced-off wastelands. The bus dropped her off at a stop called Red Flag, kicking up a cloud of dust as the doors closed that made her cough. The place Clara had described was indeed hard to find. A vast area blocked off by construction hoardings, at least several dozen acres. The advertising boards on the hoardings were faded, the rusted metal sheets beneath showing through. Everywhere, buildings were half torn down, some with one wall ripped off, exposing the rebar inside. Others reduced to skeletal shells standing alone, windows all shattered, the dark, empty frames like gouged-out eyes. Broken bricks and rubble covered the ground. Weeds pushing through the cracks, grown to waist height. A small path full of crushed brick wound deeper into the site, lined on both sides with torn-down prefab slabs and discarded pipes. She followed the path for over 10 minutes, then stopped in front of a row of rust-stained corrugated metal sheds. The sheds looked like they had been temporary worker housing, long since abandoned. Rust crawled over the metal panels. Some had been torn open by the wind, revealing the pitch-black hollow inside. On the door of the innermost shed was a faded Spring Festival couplet, the red paper bleached to a dirty gray-white, the ink blurred into illegible smudges. Beside the door, someone had written 2 words in chalk: Shaw Residence. The writing was very faint, as if written long ago and washed over by rain many times. Evelyn stood before the door for a moment. It was an old wooden door, no peephole, no doorbell, just a rusted iron handle. She reached out and knocked 3 times. The sound of knuckles on wood was muffled, lonely in the vast, empty demolition zone. No response from inside. She knocked 3 more times harder. A slow, dragging shuffle of footsteps came from inside, very slow, as if the person walking was struggling to keep their balance with each step. The footsteps stopped behind the door. Then a long silence. The person inside was clearly peering through the crack, studying the visitor outside. The door opened a crack. Half of a gaunt, weathered face appeared. Franklin Shaw looked so much older than she remembered. 3 years ago, he had been a vigorous, sharp-eyed, middle-aged man. His hair graying but always meticulously combed, his judge's robe always crisply pressed, his back straight as a ruler sitting on the hearing panel. Now the old man behind the crack in the door had a full head of completely white hair, sticking up in a messy tangle like a clump of wind-scattered reeds. His eye sockets were deeply sunken, his cheekbones jutting out sharply, the skin of his face hanging slack. 2 deep nasolabial folds bracketed his mouth like knife cuts. He wore a washed-out old dress shirt, a button missing from the collar, the cuffs frayed. But his eyes hadn't changed. In those cloudy old eyes, a trace of a judge's sharpness still remained, like a rusted blade, its edge still intact. "Professor Shaw." "It's me, Evelyn Harper." Franklin Shaw's hand suddenly clenched the door frame. The hand was thin, veins bulging on the back, the knuckles swollen and misshapen, the remnants of rheumatoid arthritis. He stared at Evelyn for a full 10 seconds, then stepped back a pace, as if he had been physically struck. "You." His voice was hoarse and dry, as if he hadn't spoken to another person in a very long time. "Where have you been these 3 years?" "Abroad. Doing rehabilitation. I also worked on a few cases. I just got back last month." Franklin stared at her for another few seconds, then slowly pulled the door open wider and stepped aside. Evelyn ducked her head and entered. The inside of the warehouse was even more bare than she had imagined. The space was quite large, maybe 400 or 500 square feet, but it was piled everywhere with old case files and legal codes, barely any room to walk. The case files were stacked into small mountains, from the floor almost to the ceiling, some tied with string, others just piled haphazardly, the edges of the paper yellowed. The codes were neatly lined up against the wall, but the gilt titles on the spines had mostly flaked off, leaving only mottled traces. The windows were papered over with old newspapers, only a small gap at the top left open for light. The interior was as dim as twilight. A military-style camp bed was set up in one corner, the bedding so thin you could see the metal bars of the frame. At the head of the bed was an old electric hot pot and several instant noodle containers, along with a prescription bottle, prednisone, for the rheumatoid arthritis. The only object that looked somewhat cared for was an old judge's bench. Heaven knows where he had gotten it, solid wood, the surface still bearing the marks of a gavel's strikes. On the bench were spread several yellow judgment documents, each one carefully sheathed in a clear plastic sleeve, the edges of the sleeves worn soft from handling. Evelyn recognized those judgments. They were from several of the classic cases she had personally led 3 years ago. A cross-border M&A dispute with a value of $4.3 billion. An intellectual property infringement case that had been adopted by the Supreme Court as guiding precedent. And a demolition compensation dispute she had taken on at a legal aid clinic, helping 17 longtime residents secure compensation, 3 times the original offer. The photocopies of these judgments had been treasured by Franklin Shaw for 3 years, each one placed in its own clear sleeve, laid out on the judge's bench like a kind of memorial. "You came to find me for those items, didn't you?" Franklin sat back down beside the judge's bench, his hands folded on his knees. The posture still held the bearing of a judge, back straight, hands placed properly, like a presiding judge on the bench, even though beneath him was nothing but a rickety folding chair. "I did keep a backup copy back then." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She had come prepared for the worst. Maybe he had destroyed the evidence, maybe he had moved and couldn't be found, maybe he no longer wanted to be dragged into this. But he had kept it. Even under such difficult circumstances, he had kept it. But Franklin's next words hit like a bucket of ice water. "Half a year ago someone took it." "What?" "That night I went to the hospital to pick up a prescription. These hands are no good anymore. I have to go get cortisone shots every month." He raised his hands for Evelyn to see. The joints of all 10 fingers were swollen and deformed, like the gnarled knots on old tree roots. "When I got back, the door had been forced open. Nothing else was taken. Only that one file envelope was missing. The case files are still here, the codes are still here, my wife's photo is still here. Only that envelope was gone. He gave a bitter smile, the wrinkles around his mouth deepening. The people who came were professionals. The door lock was picked. The cylinder was intact, no signs of forced entry. The room was searched, but searched professionally. They only disturbed the case file piles, nothing else. They knew exactly what they were looking for, and they knew where it was hidden. That envelope. I kept it hidden in a secret compartment under the judge's bench for 3 years, and no one ever found it. But they went straight for it. Industry insiders, Evelyn said. Had to be. Ordinary people wouldn't know there's a secret compartment under a judge's bench. It's a standard feature in old courtroom furniture, a place for the judge to keep personal items. And they chose the night I went to the hospital to make their move. That means they had scouted my routine in advance. Franklin sighed. Over the years, quite a few people have come wanting to buy that evidence. That sister of yours sent someone, a young lawyer, said the Grant Group legal department wanted to hire me as a consultant, $20,000 a month, in exchange for handing over the backup files. I cursed him out and sent him packing. The Grant family also sent someone. Sylvia Grant, your ex-fiancée's mother, came personally, brought a box of tea and a box of health supplements, sat across from me at this judge's bench and chatted for 2 hours. She said if I handed over the envelope, she could get my full retirement benefits restored, and even help my son arrange a job overseas. I showed her the door. Left the tea and supplements untouched on the doorstep. I never imagined that in the end, they'd just come and steal it outright. Franklin lowered his head, looking at his misshapen hands. I guess they ran out of patience. Or decided I was too stubborn to be worth any more polite conversation. Evelyn's right hand clenched into a tight fist. Sylvia Grant, that woman who always wore jade prayer beads, whose smile was as serene and benevolent as a bodhisattva. She knew her methods all too well. First the polite approach, then the hard one. First pave the way with money and favors. If that road is blocked, just act directly. That was exactly how she had dealt with her 3 years ago. Professor Shaw, the specific content of that evidence. How much of it do you still remember? Franklin lifted his head. In those cloudy old eyes, a faint spark suddenly kindled. Every single page, he said, his voice carrying an unmistakable certainty. That was the last legal opinion I ever wrote in my life. Every word of it was handwritten. I wrote for 2 days and 2 nights, from the evidence review to the legal analysis to the procedural challenges. 46 pages filled. He stood up, walked over to a rusted metal cabinet in the corner, rummaged for a while, and pulled a brown leather notebook from the very bottom. The cover was glossy with wear, the corners all curled. Over the years I was afraid I'd get old and muddled and forget, so I reorganized everything I could remember from memory and wrote it all down again. But my recollections alone are useless. To win a lawsuit you need the originals. Without the originals, even the most rigorous memories are just memories. They can't be used as evidence in court. Evelyn took the notebook and opened it. Franklin Shaw's handwriting was neat and strong, a stark contrast to his deformed hands. Every character was meticulously written, horizontal lines level, verticals straight, the handwriting of a judge drafting a verdict. Every page was marked with dates, evidence reference numbers, the names of individuals involved, followed by detailed legal analysis and deductions. She quickly scanned the table of contents. Part 1. Analysis of evidence flaws in the trade secret leak charge. Part 2. Sorting through contradictions in witness testimony for the bribery charge. Part 3. Analysis of procedural violations in the hearing. Part 4. Inappropriateness of the recommended sanctions. Part 5. Investigation report on the parking garage incident. Her eyes stopped on the title of the final chapter. Investigation of the parking garage incident. Identity of the driver responsible, and his connection to Grant Group. Professor Shaw, that driver who hit me, whose man was he? Franklin flipped through a few pages of the notebook and pointed to a name. Nathan Hale. Next to it, smaller handwriting noted the details. Personal assistant to Charles Grant, tenure of 3 years and 4 months. Resigned the day immediately following the accident. Grant Group transferred $250,000 to his personal account the day after his resignation. the transaction labeled as one-time severance payment. Below was a summary of the bank transfer records, with account numbers, dates, and amounts noted. $250,000. Severance for a personal assistant, equivalent to 15 years of his salary combined. Franklin said. The source of this money was a corporate account of a Grant Group subsidiary. The person who processed it was the CFO at the time. He's retired now, but if you can find him, the original paperwork in his hands is ironclad proof. Where did Nathan Hale go afterward? He went back to his hometown, opened a small supermarket in some county town upstate. I don't know the exact address, but I still have his cell phone number from back then. Franklin pulled a yellowing address book from a drawer, flipped to a certain page, and pointed to a line of faded writing. He used a dual SIM phone back then, and he changed his number right after the incident. But this one was his hometown number. He might have kept it. I tried calling it later. It's been disconnected. But the number itself might still be useful. Evelyn used her phone to photograph the number. Then she stood up and bowed deeply to Franklin Shaw. The bow lasted a long time. So long that Franklin, flustered, stood up wanting to help her up but not daring to touch her. Professor Shaw, thank you. That dissenting vote you cast back then was the single greatest reason I managed to hold on these past 3 years. Franklin turned his head away. He clenched his jaw, refusing to let the tears fall, but his shoulders trembled faintly. After a long moment, he drew a deep breath and turned back to face her. His voice hoarse but each word crystal clear. Don't say that. I only did what I was supposed to do. Your mother was my supervising professor when I was in law school. The very first lesson she taught me was that the law must never yield to injustice. And yet, in the end, I couldn't even protect her daughter. Evelyn's mother, Helen Miner, chair of the Civil and Commercial Law Department at the law school, a doctoral advisor, who had trained an entire generation of commercial law talent. Franklin Shaw had been one of her very first graduate students, when she was still a young lecturer not much older than him. He remembered it clearly. That first class, Helen Miner wrote a line on the blackboard. The law must never yield to injustice. Then she turned around and looked at the dozens of young faces in the lecture hall, and said something they would remember for the rest of their lives. In the future you will become judges, prosecutors, and attorneys. The power in your hands is not for making a living. It is for protecting those who have no power. If a day comes when the law is trampled by power and influence, what you must protect is not your position, but the dignity of the law itself. Franklin Shaw had protected it. He had paid for it with his entire career, protecting the very words his mentor had taught him. But he still felt he had let her down. Let down the only daughter she had left behind in this world. You did protect it, Evelyn said. She placed the notebook into her briefcase, her voice very soft, but every word drove into the ground like a nail. You protected the most important thing of all, the truth. She pulled an envelope from her bag and placed it on the judge's bench. Inside the envelope was a document she had arranged for someone to prepare. A petition for administrative review of his withheld pension, along with a legal opinion on the recalculation of his full retirement benefits. Professor Shaw, in my current status, it's not convenient for me to step forward openly. But regarding the issue of your withheld pension, I've already retained an attorney to file for administrative review. Just sign this petition, and someone will handle the follow-up procedures for you. Also, from the inner pocket of her briefcase, she pulled out a printed letter of appointment. Once I've taken back everything that needs to be taken back, I want you to come work with me. I need a legal advisor who truly understands the inner workings. There is no one else I trust but you. Franklin stared blankly at the letter of appointment. Printed on it was a line. Legal consultant, Eve and Associates. The name on the appointment line was his own. This letter had no official seal, no reference number, and at this moment carried no legal force whatsoever, because the entity it referred to had not yet been formally established. But it represented the promise Evelyn was making to him. Once she had taken back what was hers, she would need him. 2 tears finally rolled down from those cloudy old eyes. He didn't wipe them away. He let them trace down the deep wrinkles of his cheeks and fall onto the old judge's bench. Then he nodded his head, heavily and firmly. As she walked out of the warehouse, it had started raining again. The autumn rain was fine and persistent, drumming a dense, steady rhythm on the metal roof. Evelyn stood under the eaves, carefully placed the notebook into the waterproof inner layer of her canvas bag, then opened her umbrella. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. A message from Leo Hendricks. Leo Hendricks, her special assistant. 3 years ago, he had been the youngest member of her team, freshly graduated from law school, meticulous to a near-obsessive degree. After her license was revoked and her team was disbanded, Leo was purged from the firm by Charles Grant's people. He didn't seek another job. Instead, he went to Eve Capital, an unremarkable boutique investment bank specializing in cross-border M&A funds. No one knew who the true controller of that fund was. Eve Capital's acquisition funds are now in place. Controlling stakes in 2 Grant Group subsidiaries are now indirectly held through a VIE structure. Additionally, the reply letter from the ICC International Court of Arbitration has arrived, confirming that the new case you accepted under the identity frost has been formally scheduled on the docket. She read the message through. Raindrops splashed onto the phone screen, blurring a few of the words. She wiped the water away with her finger and sent a brief reply. Acknowledged. Then she deleted the thread, quickened her pace and strode through the puddles, out of this desolate industrial wasteland. Behind her, Franklin Shaw stood in the doorway of the warehouse watching her go. The white-haired old man braced one hand against the doorframe, held a battered umbrella in the other, and stood there in the autumn rain for a long, long time. Chapter 4. Light in the Darkroom. 3 days later, as promised, Liam Ashford returned to pick up the contract. He arrived at 4 in the afternoon. The autumn sunlight had already lost its force, slanting in from the alley entrance and stretching the shadow of the old locust tree long across the ground. Today he wore a dark blue suit, his tie a shade lighter than the one he'd worn last time. His cufflinks changed from platinum to black onyx. Changes in these details might go entirely unnoticed by someone else, but Evelyn noticed. Her eye for detail had been sharpened at the negotiating table for cross-border M&A deals. Any tiny shift could signal a change in the other side's stance. He sat down on the chair opposite the counter, the same chair scavenged from a second-hand market. Its cushion collapsed, the leather on its armrests cracked. But he sat down with the same composure as when he took his seat at the head of an arbitration tribunal, as if the chair beneath him were a high-backed leather judge's seat. He opened the contract. Page 1. The annotations covered half the page, suggested corrections for 3 imprecise formulations in the definition clauses, each accompanied by precise alternative language. The handwriting was of 2 kinds. The right-hand notes neat and sharp, the left-hand ones a fraction blunter but equally accurate. He didn't look up. Page 30. Risk alerts on the transitional period management clauses. The annotations flagged 4 potential loopholes, with 3 possible remediation options, each analyzing the pros, cons, and negotiation difficulty. His pace of flipping slowed. Page 90. Analysis of the serial flow requirement for cross-border regulatory approvals. National security review and antitrust review had to be conducted sequentially in practice. The contract's depiction of them as parallel processes would throw the entire deal timeline out of alignment. The notes used a flowchart spanning 2 pages to illustrate the correct sequence, each note marked with statutory timelines and foreseeable delay windows. His finger paused mid-turn, then slowly lowered. He read that spread 3 times start to finish. Page 150. A recalculation of the breakup fee clause. The original contract set the breakup fee at 3% of the transaction value, but based on the MAC clause loophole and the uncertainty of regulatory approval, the buyer's actual exit risk was far higher than that percentage. The notes recommended renegotiating the breakup fee to 5%, with a full calculation model attached, precise down to probability weightings under different scenarios. His expression shifted from scrutiny to silence, and from silence to something like a suppressed tremor. The final 5 pages were an unsolicited rewrite proposal, not just tweaking individual clauses, but converting the entire contract architecture from a UK-style template to a hybrid structure suitable for CFI US and US regulatory frameworks, retaining the common law contractual principles in the core clauses, fully adapting the approval procedures to the U.S. regulatory system, and rewording the earnout and penalty clauses in language better suited to U.S. judicial practice. For the three most critical clauses, the MAC clause, the closing conditions clause, and the breakup fee clause, there was a complete list of negotiation key points, precise down to each clause's priority and bottom-line concession. Priorities marked with stars. 5 stars meant non-negotiable, 3 stars meant limited concessions possible, 1 star meant usable as a bargaining chip. The bottom lines were marked in red pen with a clear note: negotiable before the line is reached. Walk away the moment it's touched. Liam Ashford closed the contract. He was silent for a long time. It wasn't the silence of someone who didn't know what to say. It was the silence of someone who needed time to absorb the information in front of him, like a person in court who had just heard an unexpected piece of testimony and needed a few seconds to reorder the entire case in their mind. Then he looked up at Evelyn. These revisions are not the caliber of work an ordinary contract lawyer can produce. Your familiarity with the CFI U.S. regulatory framework suggests at least 5 years or more of practical experience in cross-border M&A deals involving critical infrastructure. Your analysis of the MAC clause involves a horizontal comparison of judicial practice across 3 major jurisdictions: the strict interpretation under U.S. law, the flexible application under continental systems, and the compromise positions taken by international arbitration tribunals in foreign-related contract disputes. This kind of work cannot be produced by someone who hasn't independently led a multi-billion-dollar deal. Mr. Ashford flatters me. Evelyn sat behind the counter, a pen held in her right hand, idly doodling on a blank sheet of paper, her tone as flat as if she were discussing the day's weather. I worked as a paralegal for a few years in the past. I helped my boss organize M&A documents. I'm just copying the form without any real understanding. Copying without understanding? Liam flipped open one of the pages and pointed to a line of her annotation. The line was written with her right hand, the handwriting neat and precise, each word carrying an unshakable certainty. You wrote that the closing conditions in Section 9.2 need to simultaneously cover both EU and US foreign investment reviews. That judgment involves a predictive assessment of regulatory coordination across the 3 largest antitrust jurisdictions in the world: the US Federal Trade Commission, the European Commission's DG Comp, and their counterparts. The review standards, timelines, and approval logic of these 3 bodies are all different. You need to precisely evaluate the overlapping timeline effects of 3 separate legal systems to make that call. A paralegal can't do this. Most general counsels couldn't do it. Evelyn's writing hand paused for a fraction of a second. This man's eye was too sharp. He wasn't probing. He was stating a fact he had already confirmed. Every question he asked was not to get an answer, but to see how she would answer, whether she would keep deflecting or let a crack show or simply stop pretending. But she wasn't going to reveal herself at this juncture. The time wasn't right yet. Mr. Ashford, I just run a copy shop. She put the pen down and raised her head to look at him, her expression as calm as a polished mirror, reflecting his image without revealing her own depths. I don't understand the things you're talking about. I just read through it, felt like something was off here and there, and changed it. Maybe I got lucky and guessed right. Liam Ashford looked at her. It was a long look, carrying a sense of scrutiny that wasn't offensive. The way he read people was the same as his trial style: unhurried, no blind spots, but always maintaining the cool detachment of an observer. And then he didn't press further. He pulled another stack of cash from his wallet and placed it on the counter. Not 50,000. 100,000. Double the price she had quoted. The revisions are excellent. They're worth this price. He pushed the money toward her, the gesture carrying an unadorned decisiveness, as if paying an amount he was completely willing to pay. Then, from within the contract, he produced a gold-embossed invitation and placed it on the counter, sliding it toward her. Ms. Harper, 3 days from now, there's a corporate compliance internal training summit at the Intercontinental Hotel on the east side of the city. The attendees will be general counsels from publicly listed companies and partners from top-tier law firms. The topic is the latest trends in cross-border M&A compliance. I have a client who needs a temporary compliance advisor. Would you be willing to come and listen? The invitation card was thick, the gold-stamped letters gleaming with a low-key luster under the light. The name printed on the guest badge read, Proprietor, Eve's Copy and Document Services. Not her name, just the name of her copy shop. This detail showed he had seen through her intent to conceal her identity and had cooperated with it. This kind of understated consideration spoke more of the man's caliber than any words could. "I'll think about it," Evelyn said, putting the invitation in the drawer with the other business cards. Liam Ashford stood and walked to the door. He paused there, not turning around, just angled his body slightly and said, "The Summit's case analysis segment has a live Q&A. If you're interested, you might want to look over the latest amendments to the CFI US regulations in advance, the version that took effect this January. The case they're discussing at the summit has about 60% overlap with this contract." Then he pushed the door open and left. Evelyn watched his silhouette vanish into the alley, was silent for a moment, then opened her computer and began searching for the full text of the latest CFIUS regulatory amendments, studying them clause by clause. Chapter 5, The Compliance Summit. 3 days later, the third-floor ballroom of the Intercontinental Hotel. This hotel's ballroom was one of the most expensive venues in the city, rented by the hour at 6 figures per. A massive crystal chandelier hung from the dome. Its light refracted through the crystals into countless tiny points of brilliance, showering the entire ballroom in a flowing iridescent glow. Large modern art paintings hung on the walls, the carpet so thick footsteps made no sound, and a faint fragrance drifted through the air. A blend of white tea and cedarwood, cool and expensive. The ballroom had been converted into a conference hall for corporate compliance training. At the front was an enormous LED screen displaying the summit's theme poster, Cross-Border M&A Compliance. New rules, new challenges, new strategies. Below the stage, over a dozen rows of chairs with white slipcovers were arranged, each seat holding a beautifully printed conference booklet and a custom pen. The attendees were all general counsels and compliance heads from publicly listed U.S. companies, the men in sharp suits, the women in tailored dresses, each with a name badge pinned to their chest, printed with their company and title. In the front rows sat partners from several top-tier law firms. On the tables before them were nameplates bearing their firms' names, each one a heavyweight in the industry, Cravath, Wachtell, Skadden, Latham. The partners murmured among themselves in low voices, occasionally exchanging knowing smiles, the kind that carried years of unspoken rivalries and alliances formed within the same rarefied circles. Vivian Harper was there too. She sat in the very center of the second row. It was one of the best seats in the house, not so far forward as to upstage the senior partners in the first row, but centered enough in the second to ensure everyone could see her. She wore a sharply tailored navy blue suit dress today, the fabric crisp, the shoulder line perfectly straight, the waist fitted just right. Clearly bespoke, not off the rack. Pinned to her left lapel was that gold medal, the Bar Association's Top 10 Young Attorneys of the Year award, gleaming under the lights. On the table before her sat an elegant nameplate, Vivian Harper, Chief Legal Officer, Grant Group. Beside it were her custom Montblanc pen and a leather-bound notebook, the notebook open, a few lines of meeting notes written in a beautiful script. Several young attorneys nearby kept stealing glances at her. Someone murmured, "That's the Vivian Harper who made partner in 3 years? Chief Legal Officer of Grant Group at 26. Incredible. I heard she personally led Grant Group's entire cross-border listing project. Charles Grant really values her." Vivian wore a restrained, confident smile, her gaze directed straight ahead. Occasionally she dipped her head to write a note in her notebook, her posture as composed as if the entire conference hall were her personal stage. Her gaze would, from time to time, sweep across the side galleries, checking how many people were watching her, then return. The curve of her lips would deepen just a fraction, a tiny shift that only careful observation could catch. In the very back corner of the last row, Evelyn Harper sat quietly. She wore a very ordinary gray blazer today, not bespoke, the fabric the most basic polyblend, without a hint of sheen under the lights. Her hair was casually pulled back in a low ponytail. She wore no makeup, just a thin layer of moisturizer. Her left hand, as usual, was wrapped in its protective brace, hiding the scar on her wrist. No nameplate in front of her, no notebook, no custom pen, Just a complimentary bottle of water from the hotel and a blank sheet of paper for taking notes. No one noticed her. The young attorneys sitting near her were too busy whispering among themselves, discussing the backgrounds and gossip of the big names up front. The summit proceeded to its third segment, the live case study exercise. The moderator was a veteran compliance consultant who had spent over a decade in the Department of Justice's Antitrust Division, his voice carrying a kind of gentle but undeniable authority. A set of complex cross-border M&A contract clauses was projected onto the large screen, 8 pages in total, covering the definition clauses, closing conditions, transitional management, breakup fee mechanisms, and other core components. A countdown clock was displayed 30 minutes. The attendees were asked to identify the legal risks and propose revisions. Ladies and gentlemen, the material for this case study is adapted from real-world cases in recent years. It involves a U.S. buyer acquiring equity in a German manufacturing company with subsidiaries in the EU. You have 30 minutes. Please review every page carefully. Not just the body clauses, but also the schedules and appendices. After the moderator announced that timing had started, the room fell quiet, with only the rustle of turning pages and the scratch of pens on paper. In the front rows, partners bent their heads, scanning the materials with practiced speed, occasionally circling key clauses. The general counsels further back clustered in 2s and 3s, discussing and checking their own judgments against each other. Evelyn sat in the corner, an ordinary ballpoint pen in her right hand, working through her printed copy page by page. Her pace was neither fast nor slow, not conspicuously quick, nor deliberately drawn out. When she reached a key clause, her pen would pause for a few seconds, then write down a line or two of concise notes. The entire process was quiet, without a single attention-drawing gesture. She had, in fact, identified all the problems in this case material within 5 minutes. Its structure had about 60% overlap with the contract Liam Ashford had brought her 3 days ago, just as he had said. Both omitted regulatory approval delay from the MAC clause exclusion list. Both only specified U.S. antitrust clearance in the closing conditions while omitting EU and other foreign investment reviews. Both failed to set materiality restrictions in the transitional period management agreement. But this case material was more complex than Liam's contract. It had one especially devious trap. In Appendix C, the seller had retained the core patents in a Cayman Islands subsidiary, while the buyer was acquiring the equity of the parent company. This constituted a hidden asset carve-out, the buyer paying a fortune for the parent, while the most valuable core patents were not included in the acquisition. This trap was buried in the appendix, in a very inconspicuous place. But once missed, the entire transaction would become a farce, paying billions for an empty shell. 20 minutes in, the moderator began calling on the law firm partners in the front rows for their commentary. Several senior partners rose to speak in turn, each delivering substantive insights, though their angles varied. The Cravath partner analyzed from the angle of antitrust review, pointing out gaps in the closing conditions of Section 9. The Skadden partner approached from the angle of transitional management, noting the seller's excessive control during the interim period. The Latham partner focused on the dispute resolution clause, arguing the choice of arbitration venue was unfavorable to the buyer. The analyses were all highly professional, all hitting their marks, drawing round after round of applause. But Evelyn noticed that no one mentioned the asset carve-out trap in Appendix C. They all focused on the body of the main contract. No one had bothered to flip through those pages of appendices printed in a smaller font. Vivian Harper rose last. Before standing, she swept a glance across the room, confirming that everyone's attention was on her. Only then did she gracefully rise, clear her throat, and begin. Her voice was clear, confident, her intonation modulated, clearly well rehearsed. In my opinion, the greatest risk in this contract lies in the intellectual property ownership clause of Section 7. The seller has retained the core patents in a Cayman Islands subsidiary, while the buyer is acquiring the equity of the parent company. This constitutes a hidden asset strip. I recommend adding a patent transfer obligation to the closing conditions, compelling the seller to transfer all patents held by the Cayman subsidiary to the parent company before closing, ensuring the completeness of the asset package acquired by the buyer. Applause rippled through the room. Several general counsels nodded vigorously. One partner in the front row even half turned to glance at her. his expression carrying a note of approval. Vivian maintained her gracious smile, gave a small nod, and sat down elegantly. The way she sat was also perfectly poised, back straight, knees together and angled to one side. A textbook display of polished deportment. The moderator was just about to announce the end of the segment when a low female voice came from the back of the room. Section 7 is not the biggest risk. The room went silent. The voice was not loud, but in the quiet ballroom it was exceptionally clear, like a pebble dropped into still water. Every head turned as one toward the last row. Evelyn Harper hadn't moved from her seat. She hadn't stood up, hadn't adjusted her jacket, hadn't cleared her throat. She just sat there, a pen in her right hand, the printed contract in front of her densely covered in annotations. Her posture was completely different from the partners up front who had risen to speak with practiced eloquence. There was no hint of performance, even a kind of offhand casualness, as if she were merely offering a passing supplement. The biggest risk is Section 4.2, the effectiveness defect in the regulatory approval covenant. Every gaze was fixed on her. Someone in the front row frowned. In the back, people whispered, "Who is that?" Vivian's smile froze. Evelyn continued, her tone flat, as if she were doing an internal review of a legal opinion. Under the latest CFI-US regulations, the industry involved in this contract falls into a mandatory filing category. Section 4.2 only obligates the parties to use best efforts to obtain approval, without setting any specific timeline or default liability. Best efforts is considered a soft obligation in U.S. jurisprudence. Courts generally do not assign it binding force. This means that once a national security review is triggered, the buyer will be trapped in an indefinite waiting period, while the seller bears no exit cost. This is a classic effectiveness loophole. She flipped to the last page of the contract and pointed to an obscure appendix clause, printed in an even smaller font, densely packed, the kind of text most people probably never had the patience to finish. What's even more lethal is Appendix C, the Transitional Period Management and Operation Agreement. This appendix grants the seller full operational control over the target company during the transitional period, without imposing any restrictive clauses on major corporate actions. This means the seller can, legally mind you, sell off core assets, change the company's principal business line, or sign exclusive long-term contracts before closing. Any one of these moves would mean the buyer spending billions for an empty shell. And the Section 7 IP ownership issue Ms. Harper just raised. It is precisely because Appendix C sets no materiality restrictions that the seller is able, before closing, to legally transfer the core patents to a Cayman subsidiary. This is not a standalone IP clause problem. It's a structural defect in the Transitional Management Clause. Section 7 is the symptom. Appendix C is the root cause. Fixing Section 7 without fixing Appendix C is treating the symptom while ignoring the disease. You might plug the patent loophole, but the seller can still hollow out the target company through other means during the transitional period. Vivian's face changed color. She stood up and turned to face the last row. When her eyes finally recognized the face, her expression shifted from anger to shock, from shock to disbelief, and finally settled on a subtle, desperately suppressed panic. Her hand unconsciously clenched around the nameplate on her table, her nails digging into the cardstock. "Who are you? This is an invitation-only closed-door summit." She didn't finish her sentence, because the moderator suddenly rose. There was a trace of nervous excitement in his voice, a subtle shift that only someone who had spent years in institutional settings would catch. "Ms. Harper." The moderator half bowed toward the last row. "Just now Mr. David Grant, Vice President of Grant Group, is in the adjacent subvenue. He heard you were here and is requesting a brief consultation. Their group has been negotiating a cross-border acquisition recently, and the contract has been stalled on the approval clauses for 2 months now." The room fell silent once more. Grant Group, that was Vivian Harper's own employer. David Grant, Executive Vice President of Grant Group, overseeing strategic investments and overseas operations, held a position far higher in the group's hierarchy than Vivian Harper as Chief Legal Officer. And the Ms. Harper he was looking for by name was clearly not Vivian. Evelyn stood up and began gathering the printed contract from the table, her movements unhurried. "Sorry, I think I'm in the wrong meeting," she said. But before she could reach the door, David Grant's voice had already come from the doorway, full of urgency and the warmth of a long-time associate greeting an old partner. "Ms. Harper, it really is you. The cross-border restructuring framework you designed for us 3 years ago. We are still using it to this day. The tax optimization and compliance framework were all built on the foundation you laid back then. We've had 3 general counsels since, and none of them dared touch it. Could you just spare 10 minutes? His voice cut off abruptly the moment his eyes fell on the brace on her left wrist. Then he saw Vivian Harper sitting in the front row, Grant Group's current chief legal officer, his colleague, his subordinate. She was looking at him with an expression of extreme complexity, every last trace of color drained from her face. David Grant's expression shifted from eagerness to confusion, from confusion to awkwardness, and finally settled on an exquisitely uncomfortable embarrassment. He had just, in front of nearly 200 general counsels and law firm partners, bypassed his own company's chief legal officer to seek advice from a stranger sitting in the corner of the last row. But the words he had let slip were heard by everyone. "The cross-border restructuring framework you designed for us 3 years ago. We are still using it to this day." A chief legal officer sitting in the front row. A former employee sitting in the last row. And the vice president comes rushing in looking for the one in the back. That image alone said everything. "Come on, Mr. Grant. Let's talk outside." Evelyn picked up her briefcase and walked toward the exit. As she passed Vivian Harper, her stride paused for just a moment. Her footsteps were very light, barely making a sound, but that brief pause was enough for Vivian to feel a chill shoot up her spine. "Vivian." Her voice was very low, meant only for Vivian's ears. "You don't even understand the relationship between a MAC clause and a CFI-US review. And yet you're up here offering commentary on cross-border M&A contracts?" Vivian's body went rigid. Her hand still clutched the nameplate, her nails having gouged a deep indentation into it. "The IP ownership issue you pointed out in Section 7.3 has already been entirely undercut by the transitional period clause, because Appendix C grants the seller the full right to dispose of the core patents before closing. You didn't catch this logical loop, because you never bothered to read Appendix C. You only read the body clauses. You ignored the structural loopholes in the schedules. So the solution you propose treats the symptom but not the cause. I suggest you go back, finish reading all the contract appendices, and then try case analysis again. Otherwise, every strategy you propose is just handing the other side their victory on a silver platter." She finished speaking, straightened up, and continued toward the door. Behind her, Vivian Harper was trembling uncontrollably. The printed contract in her hands crumpled into a tight, shaking ball of waste paper. Several of the general counsels nearby exchanged deeply meaningful glances. No one spoke, but those looks said enough. The applause they had given Vivian moments ago had just been turned into a silent joke. David Grant stood awkwardly at the doorway, looking from Evelyn's retreating figure to Vivian Harper collapsed in her seat, finally realizing the magnitude of the blunder he had just committed against his own company's chief legal officer. He opened his mouth trying to find some words to smooth things over. In the end, all he could manage was a dry, stiff, "Well, Ms. Harper, let's talk somewhere else." He hurried after Evelyn's retreating figure. The air in the ballroom seemed to have been vacuumed out for a few seconds, and then a low boil of murmuring rose everywhere. Who was that just now? She did Grant Group's cross-border restructuring 3 years ago? Isn't Vivian Harper their general counsel now? Didn't you hear what Mr. Grant said? The framework is still in use, and none of the general counsels since dared touch it. Vivian sat in her seat, listening to these scattered, murmured words. Every syllable was like a needle stabbing into her. Her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't hold her pen. The name on her nameplate had been gouged into a dent by her fingernails. Everything she had spent 3 years building, the partnership title, the gleaming medal, the respect of people calling her Ms. Harper, had been shattered in those few short minutes by a few sentences from that woman. She bit her lip, stood up, and turned toward the restroom. She needed to find a place with no one around to fix her makeup, to force the tears back down. In the coffee bar of the hotel lobby, Evelyn Harper and David Grant sat at a window table. David ordered her a black coffee and himself a tea, his hands fidgeting with unease. "Miss Harper, what happened today was incredibly rash of me. I shouldn't have in front of all those people." It's fine, Mr. Grant. Evelyn cut him off, her tone softer than it had been in the conference hall. You're now running strategic investments at Grant Group. Vivian runs legal. Your colleagues, you still have to work together. Don't worry about what happened today. It has nothing to do with you. David gave her a grateful look but then sighed. Miss Harper, if I may speak plainly, after your license was revoked, the legal department went through 3 general counsels. Not one of them reached the level you were at back then. The cross-border restructuring framework was entirely your creation. We've been patching and mending it for 3 years, but no one dared touch the core structure. Vivian, forgive my bluntness, after she came on board, she tried to tear the whole thing down and start over. The tax consultant flagged 3 compliance holes on the spot. The whole thing was quietly dropped. Evelyn picked up her coffee and took a sip. It was very bitter. She hadn't added sugar. Mr. Grant, I'm just here today to listen in on the conference, nothing more. Legal affairs at your company are still Vivian's responsibility. It has nothing to do with me. If you want to discuss the contract, send it to my email. She pulled a sticky note from her briefcase and wrote down an email address. A newly registered free email account, the username a string of random characters, bearing no traceable link to the name Evelyn Harper. She handed the sticky note to David Grant, then stood up. I have another matter to attend to. I'll be going now. She walked out of the hotel lobby. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. A message from Leo Hendricks, 3 in a row, the tone urgent. Trouble. Vivian Harper's PR team just released a press statement claiming you impersonated a legal advisor and swindled people at the compliance summit. They've attached a photo of you sitting in the corner looking like you were dozing off. The press release is already out on several legal media accounts, and a preheated trending hashtag has been set up. Disbarred con artist lawyer sneaks into compliance summit. A follow-up message. The troll army Vivian hired has already started flooding the public square. Do you want me to release our evidence now? Evelyn stood under the colonnade outside the hotel entrance, read through the 3 messages, and lifted her head to look at the sky. The early autumn sky was high and clean, a few white clouds drifting lazily past, the sunlight gentle on the wide avenue. She typed back 4 words. Not yet. Let her crank up the heat. Call me when the trolls push it into the top 10 trending. She put away her phone, hailed a cab, and went back to her old alley.